If you have a race car, a project car, or even a side-by-side and do any kind of cold weather driving, you need a heater. But if you have a habit of only driving your Garage Queen in fair weather, you may have even done like me and removed your factory HVAC system entirely to save weight or free up space for other mods. That's exactly what I did to my all-wheel drive converted Honda Civic a few years back, and I never really missed it. But after moving to the Midwest and living here for a few years, where car season is shorter than your New Year's resolution, I ended up finding some winter car events to attend and began regretting my decision to pull the heater. There's no way to put the factory heater back in because that real estate has long been claimed by other more important things. So what's the solution? Well, in my build video here, I briefly mentioned how I made a custom heater setup and got bombarded in the comments with requests to spill the beans. So, because you asked for it, I pulled my entire dash out once again to show you how it's done. This is a USA-made auxiliary cab heater unit from Inferno Heaters. It's advertised as being for enclosed UTV cabs like Polaris and Yamaha and runs off the existing coolant system. All you need is a way to tap into it. To do that, the idea is to use some adapter fittings to splice into your radiator hose, install the feed and return lines, and voila, heat. Except, of course, it's not quite that simple. So let's dive into this and I'll show you exactly how I created a fully custom heater system in a few simple but not necessarily easy steps. The first step is choosing a location for the heater core. You'll need to choose a unit that puts out the amount of heat you need, packaged in a core and fan combo that fits your space, so the location is the key factor to decide on first. For a golden era Honda Civic, the only mounting point that really makes sense is either up under the middle of the dash or behind the glove box, which probably applies to most cars. Side note, if you're interested in a video that goes into some of the custom wiring solutions I've come up with, drop a comment below and I'll add it to the list. For this particular spot under the dash, the Inferno Slim series was the best option, since it uses a slim axial fan made for narrow spots just like this. I could have gone with the compact series, but the bulky centrifugal fan makes for a package that's basically cube-shaped, so I needed something slimmer. I chose the grill option with 4 outputs since I knew I'd need air routed to a few different areas. It uses 2-inch air duct hose and 5/8-inch heater hose, which I ordered from Inferno at the same time, along with a handful of other parts you'll see later in the video. Luckily, Inferno lists the dimensions, BTU output, and fan output for all of their units, so choosing one to fit your car is pretty simple. Just a heads up though, all the airflow figures for the SPAL fans on the Inferno site list the flow rates in the wrong units, which makes it seem like the fans flow more than they actually do. For example, this Slim Series fan is listed by Inferno at 520 CFM, but the SPAL website shows 520 cubic meters per hour, which equates to just over 300 CFM. The product seems rock solid as far as quality, so I'd chalk it up to an honest mistake. Anyway, we were discussing mounting locations. I knew the priority for my system was going to be defrost, so I wanted to figure out a way to use the factory defrost ducting already built into the car, which affects the mounting location. In an EG Civic like mine, the defrost ducts are built into the metal frame under the windshield, and air is forced through a rectangular opening in the underside by a factory fan. It then blows through the metal labyrinth and out the plastic openings in the dash itself, which direct airflow onto the windshield. The factory blower fan also connects to molded plastic tubes that run through the factory dash to guide air to the vents. The tricky part here is coming up with a way to force air from a round hose into a rectangular hole without leaks. To solve this problem, I made a simple cover plate for the dash defrost opening out of 1/8-inch ABS plastic. I used double-sided foam tape around the perimeter to seal it to the metal frame and then cut holes just big enough for the air duct hoses to fit tightly without the need for any fasteners. But we'll get into the air duct routing in the next step. To mount the core, I first drilled 4 small holes in the underside of the dash frame, matching the width of the heater core mounting brackets, which you'll need to do before you install the plastic block-off plate. I then slipped a long M8 bolt down through the top of each hole and secured them with flange nuts, effectively creating 4 semi-permanent mounting studs. The heater core can then be slipped onto the protruding bolts and secured with a second nut. There are 4 total mounting holes on the included mounting brackets, but in my case there's only room to use 2, which you'll understand more when you see the air duct routing. Once the defrost opening is covered up and the heater core is mocked up in place, we can move on to step 2, which is running the coolant lines. This is the most complex and important part, so let me enlighten you with my failures so you can avoid having your own. I'm not a fluid dynamics expert by any means, but it was clear upon first installation that my factory mimicking hose configuration resulted in almost no discernible coolant flow through the heater core. What little heat came off the core was simply being transferred down the lines by way of conduction, so when turning on the fan, there was a quick burst of initial heat, followed by an endless supply of ambient temperature air. It turns out that liquid, much like electricity, is a lazy bastard and will always take the path of least resistance. The factory water pump pushes all the coolant through the big radiator hose and basically leaves the smaller heater hose with a mere trickle. I studied the factory K-series hose and flow diagrams and tested multiple configurations, all the while wondering why it worked with the factory system and not with this one. Eventually, I just realized there's a better way. Enter the booster pump. It's made specifically for high-performance cooling systems and for adding a little extra flow wherever it's needed. Auxiliary water pumps are actually pretty common in factory-spec vehicles, especially turbocharged European makes like BMW, Mercedes, and Volkswagen. They're also becoming more common in hybrids and vehicles with auto start-stop functions to keep hot coolant flowing through the heater core when the engine is off. So I took a page out of their book, did a little research on flow rates, and settled on this one. A Davies Craig DC 9051 electric water pump. It flows 6 gallons per minute, only draws 1.25 amps, comes with a mounting bracket, and is compact enough to fit just about anywhere in the engine bay. This ended up being the perfect solution for getting sufficient coolant flow through the heater core and immediately fixed my no heat problem. So, how exactly do you route these lines and properly integrate a booster pump into your circuit? Well, first you need to identify where your coolant source is. Since I have an aftermarket upper coolant housing and wasn't running a heater before, I just had a plug where the heater hose would normally exit. Lucky for me, the coolant housing came with a removable heater hose fitting to replace the plug. So after draining the coolant, I swapped that in and started planning how to route the hoses into the cabin. The original heater hose location on the firewall is already taken up by my K-swap shifter cables, so I chose this spot here on the firewall for the new hoses. Ideally, you'll want to choose a spot on your firewall that's single wall, not double wall. Otherwise, you'll need a creative grommet solution that will accommodate double wall thickness. You can get quality firewall grommets directly from Inferno heaters like I did, but make sure you physically have them in your hands before drilling your holes so that you can measure the exact diameter of the seat portion of the grommet. Standard 5/8 heater hose is just under 1 inch outside diameter, and you need to leave room for the rubber grommet. So in my case, each hole needed to be drilled to 1 3/8 inches in diameter to accommodate the Inferno grommets. The hose routing from the engine bay through the firewall should be as straight and short as possible, which ends up being a little more challenging than you'd think. Unmolded, universal heater hose can't bend very tightly before it kinks, so routing takes some planning and testing to make sure you don't restrict the coolant flow. Once I identified the coolant outlet on the head and where the firewall penetrations would be, I installed the booster pump in the engine bay at a point below the outlet on the cylinder head to guarantee it never runs dry. Because the inlet outlet ports are situated at a 90-degree angle relative to each other, it also needs to be oriented in a way that allows each of these hoses to point towards their respective destinations. You can start to see how this whole packaging thing gets complex very quickly. In the end, I routed the feed hose from the head directly to the center inlet of the pump, then continued with a second feed hose from the pump outlet through the firewall to one of the fittings on the heater core itself. The return hose then goes from the second fitting on the heater core back through the firewall and into one of the factory coolant hoses. This is where you need to pay attention. In my case, this means tapping into the factory bypass hose that routes under the intake manifold along the block to the back of the thermostat housing. The splice was handled using a 5/8 inch Y adapter sourced online. Doing it this way ensures that your heater circuit bypasses the thermostat so that even if the car is cold and the thermostat is closed, you still get unobstructed flow through the block and head to the heater core and back again. This is how they do it from the factory, so I made sure to keep it that way. You've also got to make sure your heater return line is directed into the factory line with the direction of flow and not against it. Be warned, if you route the lines into either of the two big radiator hoses on a thermostat controlled system, you're probably going to create issues since coolant can't flow through the radiator when the thermostat is closed. This means the booster pump is trying to push fluid into a dead end when the car is cold, which is going to result in impossibly long warm-up times for the heater core and will eventually wear out the pump. Moral of the story here is, figure out exactly how your coolant system works before you start this project. Another thing to consider is it's best to use constant tension hose clamps if possible, especially at the heater core connections inside the car to avoid leaks. If you must use worm clamps, make sure you get a quality brand like these that rounds the inner edges of the band so they don't cut into your hose and weaken it over time. If you can find T-clamps in the right size for heater hose, those are even better since they apply more even clamping pressure around the hose. To those of you who noticed the worm clamp fiasco I previously had going on in my build walkthrough video, you'll be happy to know I took care of that while filming this video. That all stemmed from the one downside to this particular pump, being that the inlet and outlet sizes are 3/4 inch instead of the standard 5/8 inch, so I had to use an adapter fitting on each side to make it work with standard heater hose. To tidy it up, I scrapped the shutoff valve, got a couple of adapter fittings to convert the coolant housing outlet itself to 3/4 inch, and just ran one unbroken line directly to the pump inlet. Well over 100,000 people have now seen that mess, so hopefully everyone can now rest easy knowing this travesty has been corrected. A shutoff valve probably isn't necessary to prevent heat soak into the cabin in the summer months, but I guess I'll find out when the time comes. When you're routing heater hoses into the cabin, keep in mind they're going to get upwards of 200 degrees Fahrenheit, so if they're close to anything that's temperature sensitive, you may want to use a thermal sleeve for protection. One last thing to consider with hose routing is air bubbles. If you mount the core as intended with the lines entering at the bottom, it's easy to get air trapped in the top of the core when filling the system for the first time, especially if it's mounted up high where it could potentially become the highest point of your cooling system. Once I got all the lines hooked up, I took the heater core off the mounts and set it horizontally on the floor of the car to allow any air bubbles to escape the core easier. I removed the upper radiator cap and ran the booster pump for a minute or two to get all the air out of the core, which is one big advantage to having a manually controlled booster pump. Of course, you need to wire in your pump before you can do this, but I'll get to that shortly. After this preliminary bleed, I remounted the core in place and moved on to the air ducts. The third and most nuanced step is deciding how to route the air. In my car, it's a tight fit under the dash, so the fan housing is right up against the firewall to allow enough space for the two upper air hoses to make a tight 90-degree bend up into the plastic defrost cover panel. As you can see, this is the reason I was only able to use 2 of the 4 mounting points I created. Essentially, half the airflow in this system is dedicated to defrost, but you could configure this any way you want if your priorities are different. The bottom 2 air openings in the fan shroud are each split 2 ways using Y adapters from Inferno. Each outlet goes immediately into a Y splitter and then into the back of the dash, feeding the factory hand warmer vents on the far left and right sides of the dash. Again, we had rectangular openings for the factory ducting, so I slipped in a simple piece of ABS sheet at the duct openings to fill the gap enough to prevent too much air leakage. I also did an adapter plate for the center dash vents as well, so I can swap an air hose over to that one if I want to in the future. The driver's side Y splits off to a hose that routes over to the driver footwell and is zip tied in place to keep my feet nice and toasty. The passenger side Y splits off to a long auxiliary hose I use for directing air wherever I need it, and usually ends up either draped over the tunnel into the driver's side footwell or used as a hand warmer. Both of these hoses are capped off with adjustable swivel vents from Inferno that open and close so I can adjust airflow as needed. Once you've got all your ducts in a row, the 4th step is wiring up the pump and fan. Both the fan and the booster pump are wired to separate dedicated relays which are controlled individually by 2 switches on the dash. Since they draw less than 6 amps combined, you could in theory wire both the pump and the fan to a single relay, controlled by a single switch to simplify the operation, but there is an upside to separating them. For one, if I'm running the heater and it starts getting too warm inside the car, I simply shut off the fan while the pump continues to circulate coolant through the system, keeping the core hot and ready, just like everyone's favorite $5 pizza. On the other hand, if I still want the airflow without the heat, I can kill the pump instead. With the flow of coolant stopped, the fan quickly extracts all the remaining heat from the coolant in the core and continues to recirculate air at cabin temperature. Due to packaging constraints, this system does not incorporate a fresh air intake, but you could easily modify your mounting location so the fan draws air through the factory intake in the dash. The only other downside here is that a 2-wire axial fan like this one operates at a single speed, and that speed is high. To get high and low speed control, you'd have to go with a 3-wire centrifugal fan like the one on the Compact series. The Slim Series spout fan draws just over 4 amps and flows a maximum of 307 CFM, which is twice the interior volume of a Honda Civic every minute. I reached out to the SPAL tech department to see if there was any way to control the speed using a voltage regulator, but they responded by saying it's designed to run right at 12 volts, plus or minus 10%. I also asked about using a PWM module, which controls speed by rapidly flipping the power on and off at variable frequencies, and they said while it is possible with a high-frequency PWM, you run the risk of damaging the fan motor if it's run at too slow of a speed. So I'll probably just leave it alone because it works great as is, and if you keep chasing small luxuries like this in a race car, at some point it kinda starts becoming a regular car again. With all the installation steps done, all that's left is to refill the coolant, fire up the car, and burp the system. If your core location ends up anywhere near the highest point of your cooling system, you can either jack up the front end of your car or unmount the core and lay it down on the floor of the car while you complete the bleeding procedure. And for the love of God, use a proper coolant funnel for this part. After a few minute warm up, flip on the booster pump and fan so you can monitor when the core starts getting hot. The booster pump pretty much takes care of any air in the heater circuit, so bleeding the main system should actually be easier than it was in stock configuration. All of this costs about $400 to $500 to do right, depending on the pump that you buy, so it isn't exactly cheap. But cheap and done right don't usually mix, so I'm fine with the trade-off for these results. The car stays toasty down to well below freezing, and the windshield stays perfectly clear, even while working up a sweat, furiously grappling around a frozen lake in sub-zero wind chill. Drop a comment if you want to see this car do some four-wheel drifties on the ice, but you know I've already got that one in the hopper. The nice part about this system is that you can customize it however you want for your application. The parts are simple and universal, and with a little planning, it's not hard to put together. Another advantage is that it doesn't interfere with your radiator setup, so if you're like me and have future plans for cooling upgrades, you don't have to worry about redoing any of the lines for the heater system down the road. So much of the work I've put into this car in the past ends up getting redone due to incompatibility with new upgrades, so I like to make a concerted effort to future-proof my systems whenever I can. For the core group of nerds still watching, these technical videos are made with you in mind, so throw me a thumbs up on your way out and consider subscribing if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments what your plans are for a custom heater setup, and I'd love to hear how you end up making this work in your car. Thank you so much for watching, catch you on the next one, and maybe I'll see you out there. Take it easy.